If you were to crash alone in enemy territory, surrounded by thousands of soldiers wanting to capture you alive, would you believe your country would wage an entire war to bring you back? In April 1972, that question ceased to be theoretical. The sky over North Vietnam was heavy, not just with clouds but with tension. An EB-66 was flying a strategic mission when an SA-2 missile cut across the horizon like a death sentence. The explosion ripped the aircraft apart in mid-air. Fire, metal, silence. In seconds, what was a routine operation turned into a disaster. Among the falling wreckage was Lieutenant Colonel Icial Hambleton, 52 years old, an experienced officer. He wasn't an impulsive young man, but a valuable brain in the Air Force. He knew too much. He knew attack patterns, codes, strategies. When his parachute opened in the smoke, he already understood the risk. If captured, he wouldn't just be a prisoner, he would be a strategic trophy. The impact on the ground was brutal. The jungle seemed alive, dense, hostile. The radio was still working. This small, crucial detail was the only line connecting him to his country. In the distance, North Vietnamese units were already moving. Time was not on his side. How many hours until they found him? How many minutes until a miscalculation revealed his position? He wasn't trained to survive days in the deep jungle under intense pursuit. Still, he began to move, inch by inch, with almost mechanical discipline. In the American command, the news hit like an electric shock. A strategic officer was isolated behind enemy lines at the very moment North Vietnam was launching a major offensive. Rescuing someone in that region wasn't just difficult, it was almost unthinkable. The question began to circulate, silently, heavily. Is it worth risking so many to save one? While Hambleton hid among bushes and mud, listening for footsteps that could be meters away, another decision was about to be made thousands of miles away. A decision that would define not only the fate of one man, but the meaning of a promise. Because at that moment the war ceased to be about territory, it became about commitment. And what the United States would do in the next few hours would prove to the world how far a nation is willing to go when it says it will not abandon its own. The answer didn't come in the form of hesitation. It came as an order. When confirmation reached command, the maps were spread out on the table with silent urgency. Hambleton wasn't just another downed pilot. He possessed sensitive information about attack patterns and electronic systems. If captured, he could alter the entire air balance in that region. The risk was real, the cost unpredictable. Still, the decision was made with a clarity that sufficed. Bring him back. Across the ocean, the military apparatus began to move. Plans were redrawn in minutes. Aircraft that had other targets were redirected. Crews received new coordinates. It wasn't just a search mission. It was an operation that could escalate rapidly. Every commander knew that the area was saturated with anti-aircraft artillery and North Vietnamese ground units. Rescuing someone there meant deliberately entering a field of fire. Meanwhile, in the jungle, Hambleton listened to short, precise instructions on the radio. Stay south of the clearing. Avoid the watercourse. Each phrase carried calculation. Each silence between transmissions seemed longer than it should have been. He knew that simply sending a signal could give away his position, but he also knew that without that radio, he would be completely alone. How many soldiers would already be closing in? How long until the tracking dogs were released? In the skies, the first fighter jets began to cross the region. The distant sound of their engines reached the jungle as a reminder that he had not been forgotten. But that also attracted enemy attention. Shots began to rise from the ground. The conflict was officially underway. The rescue mission ceased to be theoretical and became a direct confrontation. Some officers knew that this operation could cost more than a man. The cold logic of war suggested restraint. However, something bigger was at stake. If the promise not to abandon their own was broken, what would that mean for each soldier still flying over hostile territory? The decision had already been made, and now the price was beginning to be revealed. What no one knew yet was how far this promise would be taken and how many would be willing to pay for it. The third day dawned with the jungle trembling. It wasn't just the distant sound of war. It was something bigger, coordinated, calculated. In the sky, formations began to appear like dense shadows against the horizon. Strategic bombers crisscrossed above the clouds, while fighters dove at near vertical speed to suppress enemy positions. Each explosion wasn't just an attack. It was a message. America was present. Hambleton, hidden among thick vegetation, felt the ground vibrate under the impact of the bombs. The air smelled of gunpowder and burnt earth. Over the radio, a firm voice guided him with mathematical precision. "Advance 20 meters to the east. Stop! Wait!" He obeyed without question. He knew that, miles away, officers were monitoring every coordinate as if it were a game of chess played in real time. But this was no game. It was his life and the reputation of a promise. Helicopters attempted to approach under heavy cover. Anti-aircraft fire rose like an invisible wall. One pilot reported an impact. Another declared an emergency. Still, the aircraft continued to enter the hot zone. Military logic dictated that the risk was escalating too rapidly. Each new incursion made the airspace even more dangerous. How many aircraft could be lost before someone ordered a retreat? As North Vietnamese troops closed the perimeter on the ground, the contrast became stark. On one side, ground units attempted to capture a single officer. On the other, an entire air force reorganized to prevent that from happening. The world might not see every detail, but the jungle witnessed something unusual, a nation projecting its maximum power over a single man. Hambleton heard gunfire closer that afternoon. For the first time, capture seemed imminent. He held his breath as he heard voices in a foreign language breaking through the vegetation. The radio was silent for seconds that were far too long. What would happen if the signal was intercepted, if the coordinates were discovered? The tension was absolute. And it was precisely at that moment, when encirclement seemed inevitable, that a new plan began to be drawn up above the clouds, a plan that would take the operation to an even riskier and more unpredictable level. That night, the war ceased to be aerial and began to breathe at the same rhythm as Hambleton. The jungle was no longer just a hiding place, it was a trap. North Vietnamese troops closed the perimeter with silent discipline. Filtered flashlights cut through the darkness. Dogs were led along almost invisible trails. The radio transmitted an unexpected instruction. He should remain motionless for hours, even with sounds approaching. Remaining still when instinct demands to run requires something more than courage. It requires absolute trust in whoever is on the other end of the line. What few knew was that Hambleton wasn't a fighter pilot. He was an electronic warfare specialist, trained to interpret signals, not to crawl under pursuit. Even so, he began to use what he knew, memorizing firing patterns, estimating distances by the echo of explosions, calculating the time between patrols. His mind became his main weapon. At one point, to avoid imminent capture, he received an unlikely instruction to cross a partially open field under coordinated bombing cover. Advancing while bombs exploded hundreds of meters away required almost surgical precision. One mistake, and he would be within the impact radius. In the skies, a tactical surprise changed the pace of the hunt. Attack fighters began releasing smoke and suppressive ammunition into specific corridors, creating temporary movement zones. It was like opening breaches in the jungle with controlled fire. At the same time, deliberate transmissions simulated false positions to confuse the enemy. The electronic warfare that Hambleton mastered was now being used to protect him. The paradox was evident. The isolated specialist was being defended by the very discipline he helped build, but the price was rising. A helicopter was hit while attempting a low-altitude approach. The pilot managed an emergency landing, and for minutes the mission seemed on the verge of collapse. The question returned forcefully, how far to go? The answer came in the form of new, even bolder coordination. A volunteer on the ground was assigned to advance under air cover and establish direct contact. It was a risky, almost unthinkable gamble, but it carried a clear message. The promise would not be renegotiated. And as dawn began to break, it became evident that the operation was entering its most dangerous and decisive phase. The 10th day began with a silence that seemed deceptive. The jungle was too quiet. Hambleton sensed that something was about to happen. For days, he had moved under precise guidance, surviving by inches and minutes. Now, the operation was reaching its limit. The enemy was tightening its grip. Extraction routes were becoming increasingly compromised. Each previous attempt had cost aircraft, fuel, lives. The mathematics of war were not in their favor, but the promise remained intact. At the command post, the atmosphere was tense. Some officers were already talking about reducing the risk. The area was saturated with anti-aircraft artillery. The accumulated losses were real. However, the decision did not change. A new plan was authorized, riskier than all the previous ones. A volunteer pilot agreed to fly at low altitude, entering practically within direct range of enemy weapons. He knew the chances were minimal. Still, he took off. On the ground, Hambleton received brief instructions. Advance through a narrow corridor. Await a visual signal. Do not look back. Every step was calculated. He heard nearby gunfire. An enemy patrol passed within 50 meters of his position. For a few seconds, it seemed that everything would end there. But then, the sound he had been waiting for echoed in the sky. Engines approaching. The helicopter emerged, almost touching the treetops, protected by heavy air cover. Enemy fire immediately increased. The pilot maintained course. The air seemed to tear around the aircraft. On the ground, Hambleton ran like he hadn't run in his entire career. It wasn't just a race for his life. It was a race to validate a national promise. When he was pulled into the aircraft, the helicopter was still under attack. The extraction was neither clean nor simple. It was brutal, risky, almost impossible. But it was successful. The man who had fallen alone was returning home. The cost had been high. The tension at its peak. And in that instant, as the aircraft moved away from the jungle, something greater than a rescue was taking shape. The decision not to abandon had been maintained until the end. When the helicopter finally crossed the safe line and touched down, there was no immediate celebration, no applause. There was silence, a heavy silence, laden with everything that had almost happened. Hambleton descended from the aircraft, his uniform covered in mud, his gaze fixed, the days of tension etched on his face. He was alive. The promise had been fulfilled. But the true meaning of that moment was yet to emerge. For 11 days, it could have been reduced to a cold calculation. One man against dozens of aircraft, one officer against the risk of further losses. Traditional military logic would say the cost was too high. Planes shot down, pilots killed, resources diverted. But the operation was never just about strategy. It was about national identity. It was about what it means to serve, knowing that if the worst happens, you won't be treated as just a number. And this is where the story takes its most profound turn. The rescue wasn't just to save Hambleton. It was to protect something invisible, but much greater. The confidence of every man and woman who wore that uniform. Every pilot who still took off over hostile territory needed to know that the promise was real, that it wasn't just talk, that it wasn't propaganda, it was practice. Upon returning, Hambleton didn't first talk about fear. He spoke about the sound of the engines in the sky, about the moment he realized the entire nation had rallied because of him. And there lay the truth that few see. American power lay not only in the ability to bomb, but in the conscious decision not to give up. America could have chosen the simpler path. It could have assessed the risk and ended the operation, but it chose to keep its word. And that choice resonated beyond the jungles of Vietnam. It resonated in the barracks, in the families awaiting news, in the veterans who carried difficult memories for decades, because a nation's strength lies not only in its military superiority, it lies in its faithfulness to its promises. If you served, you understand the weight of this decision. If you respect this generation, you know that stories like this cannot be forgotten. This is not just a war narrative. It is an affirmation of commitment and sovereignty. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you episodes that deserve to be remembered. Like this video to strengthen this community of memory and respect. And leave your questions, reflections, or experiences in the comments. Your voice is part of this story.